Galileu Galilei, esta é a sua sentença. Era uma época de discórdia no mundo cristão. Ameaçada pela reforma protestante, a Igreja Católica Romana exigiu o rígido cumprimento de seu dogma, reforçado pela violenta ameaça da Inquisição. O medo da heresia estava no ar. Nesta época turbulenta, Galileu Galilei se tornaria o cientista mais famoso da Europa.
He was so confident, he was such a brilliant writer, he was a tremendous wit. If there's any one single person who can be said to have created modern science, it's got to be Galileo.
Seus primeiros experimentos foram a base da física moderna e suas observações revelaram novas verdades sobre o universo.
What we have in Galileo is a package then of somebody who is mechanically and practically very good. Somebody who is a great philosopher about nature, and somebody who is ambitious.
Mas a ambição levou Galileu a questionar a visão que a Igreja tinha do mundo e a revolucionar nossa compreensão da astronomia. Ironicamente, o próprio Galileu era um católico praticante e deu sua filha, Virgínia, para a Igreja. Como uma das irmãs de Santa Clara, ela escreveu cartas para ele, muitas das quais existem até hoje. Elas revelam a preocupação de uma filha com a angústia de seu pai, que a Igreja havia silenciado como herege e aprisionado em sua própria casa. Mas Galileu jamais perderia sua paixão por explicar o mundo natural.
I wanted people to understand that nature gave them eyes to see her works, but also brains to make them capable of understanding them.
Quem foi este homem que viu mais longe que os outros, além dos confins do universo? O que o sofrimento dele nos diz sobre o contínuo confronto entre religião e ciência?
Galileo was honest when he said that the Bible was the true word of God. He just didn't think it was a good astronomy textbook.
Os trabalhos de Galileu foram banidos pela Igreja durante séculos e só em nossa época o conflito entre ele e a Igreja acabaria. Galileu pagaria um preço terrível, mas suas descobertas mudariam o mundo. Galileu nasceu em um mundo onde cada manhã reafirmava a ideia de que o Sol se movia ao redor da Terra. Essa crença era confirmada quando o Sol parecia passar pelo céu todos os dias. Era uma ideia do universo disseminada pelo antigo filósofo Aristóteles. No centro ficava a Terra imóvel, o lar do homem. O Sol era apenas um dos muitos corpos celestes que circulavam infinitamente ao redor dela. Discordar dessa visão aceita por todos poderia ser perigoso. Uma estátua do padre Giordano Bruno marca o local em Roma, onde ele foi queimado vivo por uma série de crenças não ortodoxas. O Vaticano considerava a astronomia como uma investigação da obra de Deus.
The Church's universities had 7 basic subjects that you had to pass before you could go on to philosophy and theology. One of those subjects was astronomy. Studying the stars was a way of getting themselves out of the mundane world into a world that was more transcendent, a world that was beautiful, a world that was eternal.
Na juventude, Galileu cogitou a ideia de se tornar um padre. Em vez disso, ele entrou para a Universidade de Medicina de Pisa em 1581. O currículo de Pisa era determinado pelas autoridades jesuítas de Roma. Até os diagramas de anatomia dos livros de Galileu tinham que ser aprovados pelos jesuítas. Galileu abandonou a medicina após poucos meses e começou a estudar matemática. Entre os muitos textos que ele deixou, há um eloquente tributo ao poder da matemática de iluminar o mundo.
This grand book, The Universe, could only be understood if one learned to comprehend the language and the alphabet in which it is composed. That is, the language of mathematics, triangles, and circles, and geometric figures, without which it was impossible, humanly impossible to understand a word of it. Without it, one wandered as in a dark labyrinth.
It's so confusing, the world. Where do we find truth? Where is the real truth? And there was a sort of consensus, which Galileo felt very deeply, that in mathematics you had real truth. If there was anywhere where human beings could think like God, it was when they were thinking about mathematics. So let's combine precise observation of nature, and let's apply that one technique of thought which we know God will share with us, which is mathematics, and let's put the two together, and then we will have a really secure foundation on which we can study things.
Galileu trouxe seus estudos matemáticos para a Universidade de Pádua, a 64 quilômetros de Veneza, longe de Roma o suficiente para evitar a influência dos jesuítas e de seu currículo oficial.
And Padua itself was a university. It was founded in 1222 by breakaway students. It wasn't chartered by a king or by a pope. It was absolutely free and had the Free Republic of Venice as its supervisor. So getting a job in Padua was as close to getting academic freedom as you could want, certainly in Italy and probably rather uniquely in Europe.
O próprio Galileu tinha 3 filhos ilegítimos. A mais velha, Virgínia, nasceu em 1600.
The birth records in Padua say that she was born of fornication. Because Galileo was not married to her mother, they didn't live together. I suppose he might have lived with her if he'd wanted to, but his house was full of students, and he worked at odd hours, so he didn't really keep his mistress or his children in the house where he lived.
Apesar das complicações, Galileu prosperou na liberdade de Pádua e se tornou um intelectual ambicioso. Sempre fascinado por novos instrumentos, Galileu ouviu dizer que um artesão da Holanda havia descoberto um novo uso para as lentes de óculos comuns. O primeiro telescópio a chegar a Veneza era um brinquedo, uma novidade criada para animar as festas.
Spectacles, compared to telescopes, are very low tech, but they had been around for several hundred years. It was only when lenses became available in certain range of strengths that one could take the weakest convex lens and combine it with the strongest concave lens and get an appreciable magnifying effect.
Galileu decidiu transformar o brinquedo do holandês em um instrumento útil.
Hearing reports of a new invention from a lens maker in Holland, I determined to fashion a device for myself and was able to make considerable improvements in it.
Galileo realized that spectacle makers could not give him the lenses that he needed in order to make this device more powerful. They just weren't good enough, and they weren't the right strength. And so, in order to improve the instrument, he had to teach himself to grind lenses. And that is extremely difficult. And it certainly was in 1610.
A princípio, Galileu só estava interessado na ótica do telescópio. Com suas lentes aprimoradas, ele aumentou a força em 10 vezes. Mas suas lentes faziam mais do que aumentar. Ao remodelar estes pedaços de vidro, Galileu acabaria mudando a nossa visão do mundo. Com seu telescópio, Galileu primeiro decidiu ganhar dinheiro. O arsenal naval de Veneza era um dos maiores da Europa. E se o arsenal pudesse avistar navios inimigos horas antes de eles aparecerem no porto, isso não daria uma grande vantagem à marinha? Instalando seu novo instrumento no topo da Torre de São Marco, Galileu fez demonstrações persuasivas e realistas.
Numerous gentlemen and senators more than once climbed the stairs of the highest bell towers of Venice to observe vessels so far away at sea that 2 hours and more were required before they could be seen by naked eye without my spyglass.
O Senado veneziano emitiu uma ordem para que Galileu fornecesse telescópios ao arsenal. Galileu recebeu um generoso salário vitalício por seu serviço à República. Parte cientista e parte empreendedor, por enquanto o futuro dele parecia promissor. Mas logo seu telescópio provocaria uma polêmica que ameaçaria destruir seu criador. A filha de Galileu tinha apenas 9 anos de idade, em uma noite de novembro de 1609. Foi nessa noite que Galileu, pela primeira vez, apontou seu telescópio para a lua, que se escondia atrás das colinas de Pádua, e começou a desenhar o que observava. Foi o começo de 8 semanas de noites em claro em seu pequeno pátio, que se transformou no principal observatório astronômico do mundo.
From my observations, I've been led to the opinion that the surface of the moon is not smooth, uniform, as a great number of philosophers believe it and the other heavenly bodies to be, but is uneven, rough, and full of cavities and prominences, being not unlike the face of the earth, relieved by chains of mountains and deep valleys.
A lua que Galileu viu era parecida com a Terra, e ele desenhou suas características em detalhes. Se a superfície de um corpo celeste era parecida com a da Terra, talvez o céu e a Terra não fossem tão diferentes quanto todos pensavam.
Galileo had observed the moon through a series of phases, and he apparently made some adaptations to his instrument and began exploring the planets. Now, Jupiter was the one that was in the most favorable position for observation. It was closest to the Earth at that particular point. And when Galileo looked at Jupiter, he saw 3 very bright little stars, invisible with the naked eye, on a line with Jupiter. And he remarked on that. He had no idea what they were. I mean, he thought that, of course, they were what they used to call fixed stars. In other words, the things that we call stars. But then, since it's such a remarkable configuration, he came back to it the next night. And, well, yes, there were still 3 stars, but their relative position to Jupiter had changed. And so within a week, he realized that what we have here are moons of Jupiter. Like the moon goes around the Earth, these moons go around Jupiter, and there are 4 of them.
4 planets, never seen from the beginning of the world, right up to our present day. These wandering little stars make their journeys around the planet Jupiter with a marvelous speed and with mutually different motions, like children of the same family.
Em pouco mais de uma semana, Galileu havia encontrado os primeiros novos corpos astronômicos descobertos desde a antiguidade. Esta descoberta contradizia a crença de que o universo girava ao redor da Terra. Isso acabaria colocando-o em conflito com o dogma da Igreja. Mas, por enquanto, Galileu estava
He
radiante.
rushed into print because he knew he could get scooped. If we date the discovery from the first observation of Jupiter's satellites until he realized they were moons, January the 7th to January the 15th, he was in print by March the 12th. The book was out.
Sidereus Nuncius, o mensageiro estelar, era um entusiasmado anúncio da astronomia telescópica. A primeira edição se esgotou em poucos dias, e a notícia de Galileu e seu incrível telescópio se espalhou pela Europa. Galileu se tornou um defensor de sua nova astronomia e da observação científica. Mas à medida que sua fama aumentava, também aumentava sua reputação de arrogante. Tornando o invisível agora visível, o telescópio estava começando a revolucionar a astronomia. Desde a antiguidade, os astrônomos tentavam explicar os movimentos dos corpos celestes, concluindo que eles estavam presos a esferas de cristal transparentes, girando umas dentro das outras. O astrônomo grego Ptolomeu desenvolveu o sistema em detalhes para explicar os movimentos do Sol, da Lua, das estrelas e dos planetas, tudo o que podia ser visto a olho nu. E no centro do elaborado sistema de Ptolomeu ficava a Terra, sólida e imóvel.
The Ptolemaic system was filled with ingenious geometrical devices. It made it possible for people to compute where the planets were to be, and this was useful, let us say, for astrology. It was useful if you just wanted to keep track of where things were in the sky. But it wasn't perfect.
60 anos antes do telescópio, um clérigo polonês, Nicolau Copérnico, notou que os cálculos necessários para prever as posições dos planetas no céu seriam simplificados se ele considerasse que o Sol e não a Terra ficava no centro do universo.
Copernicus described the sun as though on a royal throne, ruling the planets that circled around it. It was a wonderful system aesthetically. For decades after his book, most astronomers simply suspended judgment. The reason was that there was no observational evidence that the Earth moved. In fact, it seemed almost silly that the Earth moved.
No sistema de Copérnico, a Terra nunca estava imóvel. Ela tinha dois movimentos distintos, girando ao redor do Sol todos os anos e girando sobre seu próprio eixo uma vez ao dia.
Copernicus was a little bit reluctant even to publish his system because he figured there would be a lot of criticism of it.
The thing that Copernicus suggested just made him really the laughing stock of Europe, because he was saying here is the Earth is actually whizzing round at a huge speed, about 700 or 800 miles an hour. That's just going round on its axis, and in addition it's going round the sun at about 30 miles a second. I mean, they were saying, this is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, look at the ground, it's as solid as you can see. Clearly the Earth is not moving. Nothing could be more obvious than the fact that the Earth isn't moving. If it was moving, everything would be flying off it. I mean, church steeples would fall down, birds couldn't keep up with it, clouds would go disappearing over the western horizon and things like this.
Galileu havia lido Copérnico e já suspeitava que o sistema dele estivesse correto. Mas mesmo com seu telescópio, ele não via uma maneira de provar que a Terra girava ao redor do Sol. Primeiro ele voltaria para a Toscana, onde nasceu. Florença, a capital da Toscana, atraía muito o jovem em ascensão. Famoso lar de Dante e Michelangelo, Florença era governada há séculos pela família Médici. Uma fonte de grande riqueza e poder, a família dominava os bancos e o comércio e era influente nas questões da igreja. As esferas do brasão dos Médicis enfeitavam palácios por toda a cidade. Para Galileu, não poderia haver honra maior do que ter o Duque Cosimo de Médici como patrono.
Galileo is looking for social improvement, and he has tried several times to get patronage from the Medici, and here he sees his ticket. The Grand Duke of Tuscany is one of 4 brothers. Galileo has discovered 4 moons around Jupiter. Shrewdly wants to name him after his prospective Medici patrons.
Uma cópia do Mensageiro Estelar, o melhor telescópio de Galileu e um apelo pessoal são enviados a Florença.
It is up to our sovereign whether I spend the rest of my days here in Venice or return to Florence. If I'm to return, I desire that your Highness shall give me leave and leisure without my being occupied in teaching. Finally, I desire of His Highness that in addition to the title of mathematician, he will annex the title of philosopher.
Galileo points out how bad his position is at Padua, how he doesn't have any time for research, how he's overrun by students, and what he would like would be to serve a great ruler and to do research.
Algumas semanas mais tarde, os escritórios dos Médicis na Uffizi enviaram uma carta a Galileu convidando-o para ser matemático e filósofo da corte dos Médicis. Aqui ele ficaria no centro da vida social e intelectual de Florença.
Florentines were known for arguing about everything, having lively discussions, and that's what Galileo was about. And there was tremendous appeal for him, and even more status in being attached to the court of the Grand Duke. And there were friends of Galileo's who warned him that he wouldn't be as safe in his radical beliefs in Tuscany, that Venice had more of a sense of independence from the Pope than Tuscany had.
Os Médicis eram ricos e cultos, mas também obedeciam a Roma. Com fortes laços com o Vaticano, a família havia produzido vários papas e cardeais. Eles não imaginavam as dificuldades que seu novo filósofo enfrentaria. Deixando para trás sua amante e seu filho pequeno, Galileu colocou sua filha Virgínia e a irmã mais nova dela, Lívia, no convento de São Mateus, em Arcetri, perto de Florença.
It was not unusual in Italy at that time to put young girls in a convent for safekeeping, to make sure they remained virgins, although it was no guarantee. But because Virginia was illegitimate, her chances for marriage were more complicated than they might have been. She would have needed a large dowry and the proper husband. And Galileo was not a wealthy man.
Esperava-se que jovens freiras como Virgínia cortassem os laços com o mundo externo. Até suas famílias eram mantidas à distância.
To look at what happened to the father-daughter relationship once Virginia had taken her vows gives one a sense of terrible loss, almost a living death. There's a physical barrier between them in this grill. And yet, that again overlooks the tremendous pride of the typical Italian Catholic family then, of having a priest in the family, a nun. You were putting that child in the service of God. And what could be more important?
I would not say that his placing his daughters in the convent was in any sense an act of faith on his part. In fact, it was an avenue of something to do with them, because after all, their mother had only been his mistress. They were illegitimate, hence presumably not marriageable. So what to do? He supported them, but not very lavishly.
No decorrer de 20 anos, Virgínia escreveria dezenas de cartas para o pai de dentro dos muros do convento. Os empregados de Galileu levavam as cartas em cestas de comida ou roupas. Muitas das cartas de Virgínia ainda existem, embora todas as respostas de seu pai tenham desaparecido. As cartas dela sugerem um laço duradouro entre os dois, apesar das dificuldades da vida no convento.
Most illustrious Lord Father, meu quarto está terrivelmente frio agora, e eu não vejo como suportarei isso, a menos que o Senhor me ajude, emprestando-me um de seus dosséis, que não esteja usando. Eu estou devolvendo o restante de seus colarinhos que eu costurei. Eu rezo para que Deus lhe conceda o melhor bem-estar possível. De São Mateus em Arcetre, sua afetuosa filha.
Ao contrário da vida de sua filha, a de Galileu estava se tornando mais confortável e segura o bastante para assumir um risco, até no ambiente doutrinário de Florença. Galileu adotou a visão de que Copérnico estava certo. O Sol e não a Terra era o centro do nosso sistema planetário. Meses se passaram enquanto ele tentava provar isso.
For him, demonstration was the mark of science. For something to count as a scientific claim, it had to be demonstrated. It had to be conclusively shown to be the case. Anything short of that was called conjecture or opinion.
A carta de Galileu a Madame Cristina, cujo objetivo era esclarecer as diferenças entre a ciência e a Bíblia, acabou sendo vista como um ataque à própria Bíblia.
And that letter gets circulated, and local priests read it, and they're outraged, and they're sending copies to Rome, and they're saying to people at the Inquisition, you should investigate Galileo, you should do something about this guy's a heretic.
Galileu sabia o que podia acontecer aos hereges quando os cardeais da Inquisição se organizavam para purificar a sociedade combatendo a heresia. Seu principal trabalho era a proibição de livros, mas a Inquisição também podia torturar e executar. Muitos hereges morreram nas masmorras de Roma, incluindo o famoso Giordano Bruno, ex-padre e estudioso da ciência. Para a Inquisição, medidas extremas eram justificáveis. A dor infligida para salvar a alma de um herege não era nada comparada à dor da maldição eterna.
One of the things that the papacy wants to show to a united Europe, Catholics above all, is that there's no tolerance for dissent, that dissent will be rooted out and punished. A Scottish heretic is burned at the stake with a pitch shirt so that he'll burn all the more brightly. And Bruno, who's burned alive, which is quite unusual. Most people are burned when corpses, is one of a whole series of people who are put to death as a way of showing that orthodoxy will be enforced.
Giordano Bruno foi um padre e charlatão da nova era que negava a divindade de Cristo. Mas, como Galileu, ele havia descrito uma visão do universo na qual a Terra girava ao redor do Sol.
There's been a lot of different views as to how much the Bruno parallel weighed on Galileo. Undoubtedly, it must have had some influence. He realized, of course, what had happened to Bruno. I doubt if he thought himself to be in danger of that, but at the same time, there was that looming thing in the background that if he defied the Inquisition here, he could suffer very severe penalties.
Por trás da execução de Bruno estava o maior inquisidor de Roma, o inimigo dos hereges, cardeal Roberto Bellarmino. Agora, anos mais tarde, o mesmo cardeal Bellarmino estava recebendo relatórios sobre Galileu. Galileu foi a Roma no inverno de 1616. Como membro da corte Médici, ele se hospedou na casa de campo do embaixador da Toscana. Situada em uma colina com vista para a cidade, desta varanda Galileu podia ver as cúpulas do Vaticano enquanto aguardava sua reunião com o inquisidor cardeal Bellarmino.
Galileo tended to overestimate his own powers of persuasion. He thought that if he could go down to Rome and talk to some of the hierarchy, he could easily persuade them to remain open on the question of was the earth moving or was the earth fixed.
Os teólogos ouviam enquanto Galileu defendia a ideia de Copérnico.
Galileo is fully committed to the Copernican theory, and we mustn't see the church there as a monolith. I mean, he goes to see bishops and cardinals and theologians, and he argues his case, of course, very passionately. However, the Medici ambassador to the Vatican is writing home, listen, Galileo needs to be calm, to shut up, not go around, arguing his case so much.
Na carta, o embaixador dizia que a família Médici poderia ser envolvida em uma terrível polêmica.
Galileo is passionately involved in this fight of his, and he may well get himself in serious trouble, along with anyone who supports his views. This business is not a joke, and the man is staying here under our protection.
He thought he could convince the more open-minded theologians in Rome of the merits of the Copernican doctrine. He thought also that he could convince them that the matter of astronomy was not a matter for theologians in the first place. And so even though he must have acutely known the powers and the dangers of opposing the Inquisition, he evidently thought his own powers of persuasion were such that he could bring them around to his view.
But as he began talking up the Copernican system, he also raised alarm signals, and the conservatives in the Catholic Church decided that something had to be done.
Galileu gostou de poder se defender junto ao cardeal Bellarmino. Ele ouvira dizer que Bellarmino admirava a astronomia e que era fascinado pelo telescópio.
Bellarmine himself, who began interested in science, as he progressed in science, realized that there were a number of aspects to scientific discovery that threatened orthodoxy as he saw it, and realized that science might interfere with his theology, and decided at that point to shut down his scientific investigations. And he made a personal choice to opt for piety rather than scientific curiosity, which never, I think, is a completely satisfactory solution, and it may explain some of his virulence in going after what he perceives as scientific heresy.
Galileo will be told, formally, not to hold and defend the Copernican position. And what's more, in the decision it is stated that should Galileo refuse this order, he will be silenced.
Galileu é obrigado a virar as costas para Copérnico, cuja obra é inserida na lista dos livros proibidos.
When the theologians were merely thinking of prohibiting Copernicus's book, I held it to be true. Then those learned gentlemen actually did prohibit the work, declaring its opinions to be false and contrary to Scripture. Knowing, as I do, that it always behooves us to accept the decisions of the authorities, guided as they are by a higher insight than my humble brain could ever attain to, I declared my former defense to be merely a poetical conceit, a dream, a fancy of my own, a mere chimera.
Poucos meses após o confronto de Galileu com a Igreja, sua filha mais velha participou de um dos mais antigos rituais. Renunciando a seus bens mundanos, ela abandonou seu nome, Virgínia, e escolheu para si o nome Irmã Maria Celeste. Por tradição, um nome que Deus sussurrou para ela.
Vuoi consacrarti solennemente come sposa al nostro Signore Gesù Cristo?
Sì, lo voglio.
I think she chose her name for him, Maria Celeste, because he was so interested in the stars. Of course, it's not an out-of-the-realm name for a nun. It could be chosen completely in a religious context and would still make sense. But she was so clever that I feel certain that that was her intent.
Questa tua serva, sorella nostra. Io, Suor Maria Celeste, a lode e gloria di Dio, mi affido con tutto il cuore a questa famiglia religiosa.
In nomine Padre et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Although their lives were difficult, many of the intelligent young women actually chose the convent because they knew that would be the place they could think and write, and they had more status in society than they might have had even as married women with children. Galileo was a good Catholic, so he had no interest in fighting the church. What he was about from the very beginning of his public support of Copernicus was to bring the church to an understanding of the theory and of the theory's complete lack of threat to the church. If the church struck a defensive posture about something that looked like it had a very good chance of being true in fact, the church would face embarrassment.
A Igreja não aceitou a alegação de Galileu de que as fases de Vênus provavam que o universo era centrado no Sol. Então ele decidiu encontrar provas físicas de que a Terra se movia. Desde sua infância em Veneza, onde o nível da água podia subir ou baixar vários metros por dia, Galileu se interessava pelas marés. Da mesma forma que a água balança em um recipiente em movimento, Galileu dizia que a Terra, como um recipiente gigante girando sobre seu eixo, podia fazer com que os mares subissem e baixassem 2 vezes por dia. Ele acreditava que os movimentos da maré de uma massa de água como o Mediterrâneo podiam provar que a Terra se movia.
To make the water contained in the basin of the Mediterranean behave as it does surpasses my imagination. Perhaps that of anyone else who enters more than superficially into these reflections. Some say Aristotle, after observing the tides for a long time from some cliffs, plunged into the sea in a fit of despair and willfully destroyed himself for the mystery of them.
Up to this point, he's been very bold. In 1616, he had in fact circulated, given to some cardinals, a tract on the tides in which he argued that this is actual physical proof that the earth moves.
He does think, enthusiastically think, passionately think, that he has the key here to prove, to demonstrate the Earth's motions by turning to the motions of the tides. Now, we know that that is in fact incorrect, but he thought he had it.
Pela primeira vez, a intuição de Galileu falhou. Embora uma ligação entre as marés e as fases da Lua tivesse sido observada há séculos, Galileu rejeitava essa ideia. Para ele, a ideia de que a Lua podia influenciar acontecimentos na Terra soava como astrologia ou ocultismo. A busca por provas físicas da rotação da Terra continuaria por mais 200 anos.
I don't know. What a beautiful expression that is. So candid in its honesty. Much better than the occult explanations offered by certain philosophers. The number of people that can reason well is much smaller than those that can reason badly. If reasoning were like hauling rocks, then several reasoners might be better than one, but reasoning isn't like hauling rocks. It's like racing. A single galloping Barbary steed easily outruns 100 wagon-pulling horses.
Se, como o cavalo galopante, a Terra está girando pelo espaço, por que não sentimos o movimento? Galileu defendia o paradoxo de que a Terra podia girar sobre seu eixo rápido o bastante para criar dia e noite sem que sentíssemos o movimento.
What is really exciting about Galileo, and you see it exactly the same in Einstein too, was the way he picked up what seemed to be an absolute impossibility. He said, we have this incredibly strong evidence that the Earth is not moving. Everything that our senses tell us is that the Earth is not moving. And yet Copernicus has got these rather strong arguments from astronomy to suggest that the Earth is moving. So then Galileo says, well, this actually should tell us something very deep about how nature works.
Então ele criou um experimento hipotético intrigante. Ele usou um cavalo para representar o movimento da Terra. Se um cavaleiro soltasse uma bola enquanto estivesse imóvel, a bola cairia reto, parando ao lado do cavalo. Mas o que aconteceria se o mesmo cavaleiro soltasse a bola com o cavalo a galope? No experimento de Galileu, o avanço do cavalo seria comunicado à bola através da mão do cavaleiro. Durante a queda, a bola continuaria se movendo para a frente e ainda cairia ao lado do cavalo, igual a quando o cavalo estava parado. Para Galileu, quando o cavalo e a bola compartilhavam o mesmo movimento, era como se o movimento não existisse. Se a Terra estivesse se movendo, nós poderíamos ser levados com ela sem ter consciência de seu movimento?
There is a sort of a principle of relativity where if you're sort of moving with the Earth, everything shares the same motion. Not only is the Earth moving, but I'm sharing that motion as well. And therefore it is all hidden. It was probably the first really great thought experiment in physics. In fact, he was so confident of the result, he never even bothered to do the experiment to show it was right.
Apesar de seus problemas com a igreja, Galileu ainda recebia o apoio dos Médicis. Ele se mudou para mais perto da filha, para uma casa na colina nos arredores de Florença.
Florence is surrounded by these hills, and Arcetri, like the others, was a place where the wealthy families of Florence would have their villas. There were also normal farmhouses, there were convents. It was relatively difficult to get into town. And when the daughter of Galileo was in a convent nearby down there, and she also found for the father a location next to the convent where he had fields, he had olive oil. The daughter was also telling him that it was producing wine, but that he should not drink too much wine.
Maria Celeste is extraordinary in every way. She lives in this cloister. She is cut off from the world, and yet she has her hands in everything. The real estate market, the foods, the small favors, the laundry. She never did lose her sense of being a dutiful Italian daughter.
O velho Galileu vivia reclamando de diversos males.
I find this very thin, cold air in Florence to be most cruel to my head and to all the rest of my body. Constipation, discharge of blood, colds. Over the last 3 months, left me in such a state of despair. I'm practically confined to my room. No, to my bed, and without the benefit of either sleep or rest.
De alguma forma, todas as necessidades, doenças e interesses de Galileu chegavam até a filha dele, atrás dos muros do convento.
Meu ilustre senhor, meu pai, por favor, não se esqueça de seu estado grave de saúde e tenha mais a si mesmo que pelo jardim. Nesta quaresma, faça este sacrifício, nem que seja por mim. Prive-se um pouco do prazer da jardinagem.
Sacrifício e exaustão eram condições que a irmã Maria Celeste conhecia muito bem.
The convent where Virginia became Maria Celeste was a particularly poor convent. Being a convent of the Poor Clares, it was, of course, committed to poverty. That was their way of life, their chosen way of life. So they expected to have little to eat and to be cold in the winter and to experience harshness in every day's, every moment.
Senhor, eu lhe garanto que nunca sinto tédio, mas sinto fome provocada pela frieza de meu estômago, que não obtém o descanso de que necessita. Eu só lhe digo isso para pedir desculpas pelo desleixo de minha carta, porque eu tive que largar e voltar a pegar a pena mais de uma vez antes de terminá-la.
Maria Celeste is a bright personality. She's in a dark place. There's at least one nun who tries to kill herself in this convent. And yet, Maria Celeste always has a way of seeing the higher purpose, the higher good, that never fails her.
Tal submissão à religião não era um caminho que Galileu seguiria. Ele jamais poderia obedecer à Igreja como sua filha, nem mesmo sob o escrutínio da Inquisição. A Igreja ensinava que todos os corpos celestes eram imutáveis e puros. Mas o telescópio de Galileu continuava revelando um cosmos bem diferente da verdade oficialmente aceita. Até na superfície brilhante do Sol, Galileu observou manchas escuras, que ele batizou de manchas solares. Ele não tinha como saber que as manchas eram tempestades magnéticas, mas suas descrições eram incrivelmente precisas.
Galileo gets into an argument with a German Jesuit mathematician named Christoph Scheiner about the nature of sunspots. The German argues that these spots are in fact little satellites that go around the sun. Whereas Galileo argues that these spots are really either on the surface of the sun or very close to it, and that they're sort of like perhaps clouds.
Se o jesuíta estivesse certo e as manchas fossem satélites independentes, então a superfície do Sol continuaria pura, como exigia a doutrina.
Sunspots have a very irregular appearance, and if you can bring that out visually, then the argument that these are satellites of the sun becomes absurd. And so Galileo very carefully planned the publication of his letters of sunspots. They're all oriented properly so that you can see them from one day to the next, being sort of born on the sun and dying there. All of a sudden, in the middle of the sun, appears on one day a little spot, and the next day it grows, and then it grows some more, and then it slowly goes off the edge. Clearly, there are spots on the sun that are so irregularly shaped that they can't possibly be satellites. There is a visual essay in which you have uninterrupted views of sunspots.
Galileu fez uma série de desenhos elaborados, registrando as mudanças diárias das manchas solares. O movimento contínuo das manchas sugeria que o Sol talvez girasse sobre seu eixo.
The visual evidence is accepted by both Copernicans and people who still believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. But it is the interpretation of that evidence. And more and more and more, you see these conservative astronomers then stretching. Because if you can say that these are satellites of the sun, you can still say that the sun is perfect.
Galileu sabia que seus adversários estavam errados. Não importava se o matemático jesuíta desejava que o Sol fosse perfeito. Galileu havia demonstrado que de fato existiam manchas na superfície do Sol. Sete anos depois que a Inquisição baniu Copérnico, Galileu ficou sabendo que um novo Papa havia assumido. O Colégio dos Cardeais havia escolhido um membro de uma importante família da Toscana, um homem que Galileu considerava um amigo. Maffeo Barberini se tornaria o Papa Urbano VIII.
Urban VIII is an interesting choice for a pope at that point. He's a member of the Barberini family, and the old joke was what the barbarians didn't loot from Rome, the Barbarinis did.
His coat of arms, when he was a young prelate, had 3 horseflies. And horseflies became increasingly undignified for someone who's rising that far in the church. And so the horseflies at a certain point change into busy bees. And Maffeo Barberini therefore becomes the personification of a hard-working, productive individual.
Everything that you see that is a sign of the beautiful Renaissance Rome was either started, continued, or inspired by what Urban VIII had done.
At the bottom of the Via Veneto, you have a fountain with 3 Barberini bees, reminding you which pope gave you this water fountain, and also reminding you that you shouldn't be just lounging around at the fountain. You should be making like the bee and producing honey.
The new pope was a great fan of Galileo, who had written poems to Galileo, and all of a sudden then the situation appeared very different from the way it did in 1616.
Quando a notícia da posse de Urbano VIII chegou ao convento, Maria Celeste esperava que a igreja não silenciasse mais o seu pai. Galileu mostrou a ela uma carta que recebera de seu velho amigo, o Papa.
Pai, a felicidade que senti com a carta que o Supremo Pontífice lhe escreveu foi indescritível. A carta expressa claramente a afeição que este grande homem tem pelo Senhor. Eu a li e reli desfrutando-a a sós. E aqui eu a devolvo, como o Senhor insiste, sem tê-la mostrado a ninguém.
Galileu fez a difícil viagem de 2 semanas até Roma, especialmente para encontrar o Papa Urbano VIII. Os velhos amigos conversaram muito enquanto passeavam pelo Vaticano.
The Pope and Galileo walked around in the Vatican gardens talking about various things, and of course one of the things they talked about was whether or not Galileo could publish on the Copernican theory. And the Pope told him that as long as he limited himself to speaking about it hypothetically, there would be no problem.
Assim, contanto que a visão de Copérnico de que a Terra se movia ao redor do Sol fosse apresentada como uma hipótese, uma teoria entre muitas, Urbano VIII permitiria que ela fosse discutida.
Galileo came away from these meetings feeling that this was the time to write his big book on cosmology, which he had been promising since 1610.
Aos 60 anos, ele se dedicou a um novo livro. O Papa havia permitido que Galileu iniciasse o que para o cientista seria sua obra mais importante. Escrevendo em italiano, não em latim, divulgando suas ideias mais persuasivas com um estilo popular, Galileu queria divertir e convencer a todos sobre a teoria de Copérnico. As cartas de Maria Celeste sugerem que Galileu permitiu que a filha lesse o manuscrito inacabado.
There seems to be a genuine interest on her part in his work. Of course, she's self-denigrating. She always says, I'd love to see what you're writing if you think I could understand it. And of course, I'll promise not to talk about it to anyone else. So they have an intimacy on the work level. And possibly the most interesting thing that comes out of the letters is this strong indication that when he's working on the dialogue, their back and forth starts to include something called cuttings, which are obviously pieces of a manuscript. And it seems that she is the one who's actually preparing the manuscript.
A obra, que deveria levar meses, estendeu-se por muito mais tempo porque a doença interrompia o trabalho de Galileu. Finalmente, após 5 anos, a conclusão do manuscrito estava à vista.
By the grace of God, I've got on the right path. The book will be quite large and full of novelties, which, by writing it in the manner of a dialogue, I can introduce without affectation or drudgery. If I can just survive this winter, I shall bring it to an end and publish it immediately.
Galileu terminou seu grande livro na véspera do Natal de 1629. A obra se chamava Diálogo sobre os Sistemas Máximos.
It is a rhetorical masterpiece. Galileo explains the new view of the world. It is a debate about the world systems. Is the sun the center of the universe? Or is the earth the center of the universe? He brings forward all his wonderful discoveries with the telescope, and you're just pulled along by this narrative.
Galileu cria 3 personagens bem-humorados, 3 nobres de Veneza. O primeiro, o anfitrião, promove um debate entre seus 2 convidados. Um dos visitantes claramente fala por Copérnico e Galileu, mas o outro convidado, Simplício, o Simplório, fica repetindo as doutrinas da Igreja sobre ciência e filosofia. Galileu obteve permissão de um censor para publicar seu livro em Florença. Ele sabia que seria muito mais difícil convencer os censores de Roma. Galileu despachou um punhado de cópias para o Vaticano, Mas, antes que soubesse do resultado, uma tragédia atingiu Florença. Em 1630, a peste bubônica assolou a Toscana. Em poucas semanas, 6.000 florentinos estavam mortos e Galileu perdeu contato com Roma. Todas as noites, enquanto a cidade se escondia atrás de portas fechadas, carroças recolhiam os corpos. Os médicos andavam nas ruas usando máscaras forradas com palha para não se contaminarem.
An outbreak of bubonic plague strikes all of Italy, strikes badly in Tuscany, and because of the development of science, there's some idea that there's contagion involved. And so there are attempts by the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, which is a pretty centralized governmental system, to establish quarantines, often in terms that we'd find inhuman, sealing up people's houses.
Chiudi questa casa, non c'è più niente da fare.
Os governantes da Toscana não sabiam se confiavam na quarentena ou no poder da oração. Para garantir, eles tentaram ambas.
Parading the Madonna of Impruneta around the city is a way of invoking her divine aid, and of course, having a religious procession somewhat militates against the effect of quarantine. You hope that faith will override what looks like the law of nature.
O magistrado de saúde pública pediu ajuda ao convento de Maria Celeste.
Praying for the rest of the world really had importance, and the nuns knew that. And in fact, during the plague, they were specifically commissioned to pray 2 at a time for 40 days, round the clock. And that was considered one of the most active interventions that could be made against the plague.
Maria Celeste se preocupava com seu idoso pai. Como farmacêutica do convento, ela preparou um remédio para ele, esperando protegê-lo da infecção.
Tenha fé neste remédio, Senhor. Ele é feito à base de mel. Tome-o todas as manhãs em uma dose do tamanho de uma noz, seguida por um gole de vinho grego. O magistrado da saúde diz que ele fornece uma excelente defesa. Por favor, tome todas as precauções para proteger-se do perigo.
Lavar os lençóis em vinagre fervendo era uma das precauções, embora ninguém soubesse o motivo. O isolamento das irmãs se tornou um benefício e a infecção não as atingiu. Na primavera seguinte, a epidemia havia diminuído o bastante para permitir a comunicação com o resto da Itália. Durante meses, Galileu não teve notícias dos censores de Roma. Será que o manuscrito dele se perdera em quarentena? Será que fora roubado? O censor florentino havia aprovado o livro, mas Galileu precisava da aprovação de Roma.
The father told me more than once that tears came into his eyes when he was reading. And he acknowledged that I should be begged to publish such a book. Meanwhile, it sits in the corner, and my life wastes away. I only want to know, while I'm still alive, what is the outcome of all my hard work?
Anos antes, quando caminhou pelos jardins do Vaticano com Galileu, o Papa havia argumentado a mesma coisa, dizendo que as obras de Deus podem estar além da compreensão humana.
Urban's advisors persuaded him that he had been the model for Simplicio and that he was being made a fool.
Urban took a very angry view of the book, and the two never spoke again.
The Pope convened a special commission to look at the Galileo case, to look at the manuscript, and that commission recommended a process by the Inquisition.
A Inquisição intimou Galileu a comparecer em Roma em outubro seguinte. Ele tentou adiar a viagem, alegando estar doente. No Natal, Galileu foi novamente intimado a comparecer. Ele poderia ir espontaneamente ou poderia ir acorrentado. Enquanto se preparava para deixar Florença, a filha de Galileu tentou prepará-lo para sua aprovação.
Pai, eu lhe peço que não segure a faca desses problemas pela ponta afiada. Em vez disso, segurando-a pelo cabo, use-a para cortar todas as imperfeições que reconhecer em si mesmo e passe a compreender a frivolidade e os erros de todas as coisas terrestres.
Em Roma, Galileu mais uma vez pôde ver o Vaticano das janelas da Embaixada da Toscana. Mas durante meses, os inquisidores não apareceram. A ordem para seu julgamento chegou em abril. Como a maioria desses procedimentos, Galileu foi tratado com formalidade e civilidade.
Galileo, son of the late Vincenzo Galilei, Florentine, 70 years of age, sworn to testify the truth. Galileo Galilei, by what means and how long ago did you come to Rome?
I came to Rome on the first Sunday in Lent, in a litter.
State whether you know or can guess at the reason that you were ordered to come.
I imagine that I was ordered to present myself before the Holy Office to give an account of my recently printed book.
State whether if you were shown the said book, you would recognize it as yours?
I hope so. Yeah, if I was shown it, I hope I would recognize it.
There was shown to him a book, printed at Florence in the year 1632, with the title Dialogue by Galileo Galilei, etc. And when he had looked at it and inspected it, he said, I know this book very well, and I acknowledge it as mine. And I acknowledge all it contains as having been written by me.
A Inquisição limitou o julgamento a apenas duas questões. O cardeal Bellarmino havia proibido Galileu de defender Copérnico quando os dois se conheceram 16 anos antes. E havia Galileu desobedecido às ordens do cardeal ao escrever o livro Diálogo.
Let Galileo state what the most eminent Cardinal Bellarmine told him about the decision of the Holy Congregation of the Index on a certain day in the year 1616.
The Lord Cardinal Bellarmine informed me that the opinion of the stability of the sun and the motion of the earth was deemed to be repugnant to Holy Scripture. I believe the Cardinal notified me that it was possible to hold the opinion hypothetically, as Copernicus did.
Can Galileo explain what is in his book, which he imagines was the reason for the order that he appeared before us?
Well, when I was writing the dialogue, I did not do so because I held that the doctrine of Copernicus was true. Instead, I set forth the astronomical reasons that could be advanced on either side of the debate. I tried to show that neither side of the argument has conclusive force to favor one opinion over the other. I do not now hold, and since the determination of Cardinal Bellarmine, I have not held the condemned opinion.
Todos que leram Diálogo podiam ver que a defesa de Copérnico era o argumento mais forte do livro. O personagem Simplício, repetindo as palavras de Urbano VIII, era mais uma sátira que ciência. Galileu foi obrigado a demonstrar uma falsa humildade e isso nunca foi seu estilo.
With respect to the court, I've recently reread my dialogues after 3 years. And I freely concede that in several places a reader ignorant of my real purposes could suppose several arguments might suggest real conviction on my part. My error, I confess, was one of ambition, the natural inclination of most men with regard to their subtleties, to show themselves more skillful than other men in devising arguments in favor of propositions, even false propositions.
Galileu foi mandado para um pequeno quarto do Palácio da Inquisição. Parecia certo que seu livro seria banido. A questão agora era qual castigo cairia sobre o próprio Galileu.
It very quickly boiled down to a technicality. In 1616, Galileo had agreed not to teach or defend the Copernican theory. The accusation was he had violated this agreement. And Galileo said, no, I didn't violate the agreement. If you see, by the time you read the end of the book, I come out in favor of the Church's position, and I just bring up these other arguments as an arguing tool. Well, anybody who read the book knew better.
A notícia da prisão de Galileu chegou a Maria Celeste e ela enviou uma carta aconselhando cautela, sem saber se a carta chegaria até seu pai.
Detido nas câmaras do gabinete sagrado. Eu não falei sobre essas dificuldades a mais ninguém e guardei as desagradáveis notícias para mim mesma. Pai, agora é hora de usar a prudência que Deus lhe concedeu.
O caminho que Galileu percorreu até as câmaras onde ouviria sua sentença passava pelas clausuras de Santa Maria sopra Minerva. As paredes e o teto alertavam os hereges sobre o destino que podia aguardá-los.
The people who were conducting the Inquisition hope that anybody who's coming into the Inquisition sees these scenes of people who've died in the correct faith, realize that they should use the courage of the martyrs to confront their own case, face their heresy squarely and go off to their punishment with a clean conscience because it's been brought back to orthodoxy.
Na manhã da sentença, Galileu foi levado novamente até a Inquisição, desta vez vestindo a túnica branca de um penitente.
We pronounce sentence. We declare that you, Galileo Galilei, by reason of the matters detailed in this trial, have rendered yourself in the judgment of this holy office vehemently suspected of heresy. Namely, having held and believed a doctrine which is false and contrary to Scripture, that the sun is the center of the world and does not move, that the earth is not the center of the world and does move, we condemn you to formal imprisonment in this holy office at our pleasure.
Eles chegaram a um acordo. Galileu teve a chance de renunciar a seus erros. Em vez de passar o resto da vida em uma masmorra, Galileu se ajoelhou como mandaram.
I, Galileo, son of Vincenzo Galilei, Florentine, 70 years of age, kneeling before you, swear that I have always believed, I believe now, and with God's help I will always believe all that has been taught, held, and preached by the Holy Catholic Church. I abjure with unfeigned faith and sincere heart. I curse and detest many errors and heresies. So help me God. Amen.
O julgamento de Galileu havia acabado. Esperando na embaixada da Toscana, ele levou meses para saber quando poderia voltar para casa. Diálogo sobre os sistemas máximos foi acrescentado à lista dos livros proibidos. O livro permaneceria proibido nos 200 anos seguintes. Galileu acreditava que o Papa Urbano VIII o protegeria da censura, mas ele não o fez.
Being the Pope is different from being the Cardinal. The Pope had many battles to fight, the most important being the Protestant Reformation. And there he was, the head of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And Urban was actually accused of not doing the right things to further the Catholic cause.
The Pope maintained interest in what Galileo was doing. But the Pope, in many ways, had other concerns besides science. Urban VIII is facing the 30 Years' War. The entire reign is under the shadow of a terrible, vicious civil war that's tearing apart the Christian world.
So when Galileo came to trial, the Pope could not risk defending his friend when he personally was under such scrutiny. And Galileo became expendable.
He feels he can afford to turn his back on Galileo, and I think Galileo didn't know what was coming. Tuscany at that point has nothing but culture. Galileo is their vanguard of scientific thought. Galileo gets silenced by the Pope. So it's a Tuscan turning back and smacking his Tuscan friend, who he feels smacked him at the end of this dialogue, so that it's a wonderful Florentine vendetta.
Seis meses após o julgamento, a notícia que chegou a Florença foi de que Galileu poderia voltar para casa. Graças aos apelos do embaixador da Toscana, à intervenção da família Médici e à sutil influência da própria filha.
Estamos aguardando sua chegada com ansiedade e nos alegramos ao ver como o tempo melhorou para a sua viagem. Senhor, minha alegria é tão grande quanto inesperada.
Galileu voltou, mas ficou confinado à sua casa, proibido de lecionar, viajar ou mesmo visitar a filha sem permissão. Ao final de suas cartas, ele escrevia: de minha prisão em Arcetri.
He was under house arrest. He could not move without authorization, and also what he could do, what he could not do, was dictated by the church.
Not so many years have passed since I was often received by cardinals and princes of the city who wanted to see only for a moment some of the things that I had observed. Latin orations were occasionally recited in honor of me, the Duke's mathematician, discoverer of new planets, eyewitness of wonders unknown to the ancient philosophers. But now, now, I spend fruitless days made long by inactivity, yet brief compared to the years that have passed. My only comfort, the memory of former friendships, of which so few remain.
Como penitência, Galileu recebeu ordens para rezar semanalmente. Embora doente, Maria Celeste decidiu aliviar o fardo do pai.
Eu obtive permissão para cumprir sua sentença, Senhor, assumindo a obrigação de recitar os 7 salmos todas as semanas. Eu já comecei a cumprir essa exigência. Se eu pudesse cumprir o castigo em seu lugar, eu aceitaria uma prisão ainda mais rígida do que esta que habito. Se ao fazer isso, pudesse deixá-lo em liberdade.
Embora as cartas não falassem sobre isso, a saúde de Maria Celeste piorou durante o ano de ausência do pai.
I think that during Galileo's trial and detention after the trial, he was too broken and too needy to realize the state she'd been reduced to.
Eu não estou muito bem, mas estou tão acostumada a não ter saúde que nem penso nisso. Já que Deus deseja continuar me testando com um pouco de dor. Eu agradeço a Ele e rezo para que Ele dê ao Senhor o maior bem-estar possível.
No final de março, avisaram Galileu que Maria Celeste estava gravemente doente com febre. Durante 10 dias, Galileu foi visitá-la diariamente no convento. Mas uma noite, ela sucumbiu à disenteria, falecendo aos 33 anos de idade. Quando Maria Celeste morreu, foi como se uma luz se apagasse na vida de Galileu.
It was only when he got home, as he reports later in letters to colleagues, that he found her so weakened that she actually succumbed to a fairly common illness that need not have been fatal, but in her state proved to be fatal.
I'm full of melancholy and sadness. I'm hateful to myself. And I continually hear my beloved daughter calling out to me. Maria Celeste suffered ill health during my absence. And she didn't look after herself. Go on, goodbye. She was a woman of exquisite mind, singular goodness, most tender in her feelings towards me.
Dezenas de cartas que Galileu recebeu da filha ainda existem, mas nenhuma das cartas que ele escreveu para Maria Celeste foi encontrada. Hoje dispomos de apenas um dos lados da comunicação mantida entre pai e filha.
It's a shame, it's really a shame, we don't have his letters to her. It's clear from her letters that she loves this man, and she cares about him, and she knows what it is to love another person. And we can only hope that this love was inspired by a similar affection on his side. We'll never know.
Surely he answered her letters. There's no question about that, because all through hers runs a thread of, you asked me this, you told me that. So one can almost reconstruct what he said, but you can't hear how it sounded. What's tantalizing here is that it's also obvious that she saved all the letters, because she says that repeatedly. I keep them all, I reread them whenever I can, because this brings me great joy. So where are they? The most logical explanation is that when she died, the Mother Abbess would have burned them, buried them, done something, because Galileo's trial was such a recent memory.
Cada vez mais cego e geralmente confinado à cama, Galileu começou a reavaliar seus primeiros trabalhos.
I find how much old age lessens the vividness and speed of my thinking. I now have to struggle quite hard to understand things which, when I was younger, I discovered and proved.
Obrigado a evitar a astronomia, Galileu se voltou para uma época antes de seu telescópio para sua pesquisa genial, mas nunca publicada, sobre a física do movimento.
You get this extraordinary situation that he'd made these really great discoveries in the study of motion right back in about 1604, something like that, and he'd written it up in a Latin text back then. But it's so many other exciting things happened to Galileo. He never seems to have got around to publishing it. So it was, in a way, a blessing that he was put in house arrest. He finally made him get round to writing these results up.
Galileu havia passado metade da vida tentando provar que a Terra se move. Agora, ele terminaria algo muito mais básico, a matemática do próprio movimento. Mas era difícil medir o movimento.
It all happens just a bit too fast for you to see what is going on. Galileo hit on this wonderful idea of slowing down the motion. So instead of trying to watch a thing falling, he rolled balls down very gentle slopes so that the speed built up very, very slowly.
Galileu dizia que as bolas que desciam por inclinações suaves acelerariam da mesma forma como fariam em queda livre, só que mais lentamente. Na juventude, Galileu havia criado um plano inclinado muito preciso, uma das peças de equipamento experimental mais importantes da história da ciência. Galileu não deixou esquemas para seu plano inclinado, mas baseado nas anotações dele, o professor Roberto Caffarelli está usando o que acredita ser o desenho original de Galileu para descobrir como ele conseguiu medir a aceleração com precisão.
Galileo studia il piano inclinato come un rallentatore.
Slowing the motion of falling bodies until he was able to observe the phenomena. He was able to measure exactly how fast a ball would roll, timed with the swing of a pendulum.
So he takes this very gentle inclined plane and he lets the ball roll down and he watches how that ball speeds up and he measures how far it goes in a certain time. And then he makes his first empirical discovery that if in the first unit of time it goes 1 unit of distance, in the next unit of time it travels 3 units of distance, and in the next 5, and then the next 7. So it has this beautiful numerical progression, 1, 3, 5, 7. And he calls this the odd numbers rule. And he really is entranced by this. He knows he's made a huge discovery.
Galileu havia encontrado uma regra matemática para prever com precisão o movimento de objetos no mundo real, uma lei universal que se aplicava a qualquer corpo em queda.
Underneath this beautiful empirical law that he found a deeper law, clearly a deeper law, using mathematical logic and deductions. And this was actually the key to all the later great successes, first of Newton and then of Einstein and all the other wonders of modern science.
Na juventude, Galileu havia revolucionado a astronomia. Mas aos 74 anos de idade, seu último grande livro revolucionou a física do movimento.
From the point of view of physics, his most important contribution is his discourse on the two new sciences. Indeed, it's that book that provides the real foundation for Isaac Newton.
Uma geração depois, Newton se baseou no trabalho de Galileu para criar uma série de leis tão completas que podia descrever o movimento dos planetas em suas órbitas e como maçãs caem das árvores.
It's very difficult to judge which part of Galileo's work is most important, because on one hand, he established some of the basic laws of physics. On the other hand, through his telescope, he first discovered or proved that actually the Earth is only one of the bodies of the universe. That those things we see at night are not just little flames in the sky or in the atmosphere, but they are actual bodies similar to the Earth. That there are everywhere in the universe other bodies which may be similar or different from our own, but they are our brothers and sisters in the universe.
Quando Galileu era jovem, quase todas as pessoas imaginavam viver no centro imóvel do mundo. Armado com seu telescópio, Galileu escreveu que nossa Terra era apenas um dos muitos planetas que giravam ao redor do Sol. A Inquisição decidiu proibir o livro de Galileu, mas não conseguiu banir suas ideias.
I always think that his dialogue on the two great world systems was the persuasive book that made it intellectually respectable to believe in a moving world, a sun-centered universe. It was the book that won the war.
A Igreja Católica aceitou há muito tempo a ciência de Galileu. Mas foi só em 1992 que uma comissão papal reconsiderou seu julgamento do caso de Galileu.
John Paul II said that mistakes had been made in the Galileo case and used Galileo's language to talk about the relationship between faith and reason, between religion and science.
Dizendo que a fé nunca deveria conflitar com o raciocínio, o Papa João Paulo II usou as mesmas palavras que Galileu escrevera em sua própria defesa. O Papa, como Galileu, acreditava que a Bíblia jamais erra, mas que os teólogos podem errar em sua interpretação. O Papa expressou o remorso da Igreja pelo caso de Galileu ter contribuído para um trágico mal-entendido mútuo entre religião e ciência.
By the end of the 20th century, Galileo is almost rehabilitated.
Talvez prevendo sua própria redenção, o velho herege escreveu um alerta para seus adversários em sua cópia de diálogo.
Take note, theologians. You run the risk of someday having to condemn as heretics those who would declare, as you do, that the earth stands still.